Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Office Hours. I'm your host, as usual, Stuart Newsom. Today, we're diving into one of the most urgent topics facing rural hospitals right now, and that is just plain old financial survival. So, the title of our session really says it all: Hidden Dollars, a Rural Hospital's Guide to Financial Survival. And let's be honest, survival is not an exaggeration here. With over 70% of critical access hospitals operating at a loss, the need for a smarter, more sustainable approach has never been greater. So I'm joined today by Taylor Searfoss, who's the Vice President of NI2, which is part of the Infinix family. He works closely with hospitals across the country to uncover untapped revenue within their existing workflows. So Taylor brings a boots on the ground approach or perspective, if you will, to the conversation. So today he's going to just walk us through some practical low lift ways to spot hidden opportunities without overburdening already stretched teams. So Taylor, just how you doing today? We're so glad you're with us.
Doing great. No complaints here. Just finally getting a little bit of a break from the heat, so that's much welcomed.
Yeah, awesome. Also, it's always good to be inside. So, and it's also good for the fall air to be here. I'm really looking forward to it. We were
Me too.
just talking about football before joining and getting going live here, so that's part of the element. So the season is here. So it's always good, to have you on as office hours, Taylor. So we're always glad to have your insights. But before we dive in, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that I just want to leave time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions or any even comments, we always welcome comments as well. You just drop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll get right to them as time allows. We enjoy those questions. We want this to be more interactive with our audience. So be sure that you submit those questions and comments throughout. So with that, you ready to dive in, Taylor?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So let's start out with kind of something I mentioned earlier in the intro, with the state of the industry, so to speak.
Mhm.
One of the things I mentioned was that over 70% of critical access hospitals are operating at a loss today. So I want
Right.
to kind of ask your perspective on why is that even happening? And why do so many of the solutions that are out there feel out of reach for these providers?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we've discussed this in the past, and maybe even on here. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the recent articles. I feel like every other day, we all get the healthcare emails. There's articles coming out, and you always see rural healthcare. The crisis it's facing, the shortcomings, the cliff, the financial cliff that's you know right on the horizon for them. But this is that's a great one to open up with. It also gets me worked up sometimes. So I apologize if I go on a rant. Just feel free to chime in and stop me. But I
Oh,
actually
sure.
have
Go ahead.
some pretty good statistics on this, as well, just based on some recent articles that have come out. I made sure to jot those down because they really stood out to me. I think a lot of people on here listening, some of it might come as a shock, some of it might not. But you said over 70% of these hospitals are operating at a loss. That is such an impactful statement. But when you pair that with a broader financial backdrop, it really drives home how dire the situation might be. You know, if I don't know if all of our listeners are familiar with NRHA, they're the National Rural Health Association. They're an amazing organization that works with, a lot of times you think rural health, you think just way out in the boonies, hospitals are out by themselves, but really you're talking a lot of times these county medical centers, community medical centers that are closer to metro areas but serve rural populations. So it's more than just these freestanding facilities out by themselves. It impacts a lot of these. Um, Great organization to look into. So that's my pitch for them. But they stated in one of their recent articles what we just mentioned, that more than 70% of these hospitals are running in the red. And that actually comes from some work they did with the American Hospital Association. Um, it shows how widespread the issue is in rural health today. It doesn't just stop there. So if you zoom out a bit, about 48% of those hospitals overall lost money. And a recent statistics, I made sure to write this one down. In 2023, 48% of hospitals, rural hospitals, lost money. That is nearly half of these facilities are struggling just to break even. And then, that's just their operating, but we're not even talking closures yet. So that same article mentioned that 136 hospitals have shut down between 2010 and 2021. So that's nearly one per month over 11 years. So some years were especially brutal. You think little thing called COVID. We all remember that. 19 hospitals just that year had to close their doors. And when you're talking about a facility closing down in these areas, it's often the big economic lifeblood of that community. The same article went on to talk about and said that 1 in every 12 jobs in these type of communities are paired to either the rural health clinic or that rural health organization somehow. And they're generating over $220 billion in economic activity each year. So when one of those closes, you think what that would do to an already pretty fragile community. And let's be honest, a lot of times, you mentioned solutions, they might feel out of reach for those facilities because if they're just struggling to stay alive, they're surviving, not thriving. They don't have bulky IT budgets. They don't have the full size and full time analytics teams. They're understaffed, under resourced. They're stuck in reactive mode. So their margins are so thin that these institutions are often, like I said, just surviving, and they're just trying to get by to keep the doors open and meet their population. So I would say, yeah, the numbers aren't just statistics. They're a wake up call. Honestly, uncovering, the hidden dollars, which we've kind of titled this. That's why it matters so much, because the recovery just isn't about, fantasy tech, the new latest greatest thing. It's about, hey, claiming the revenue that's already there and doing it in a way that's right, fits right into the limited capacity of these hospitals that they have.
Right,
All
right.
right,
Yeah.
I'll pause there. I could keep going on,
No,
but
no, no, no. But
I got
that's
my
very
soapbox.
impactful. I mean, yeah, it's behind the stats. I mean, what
Yeah,
you've stated is that these are not only people's lives from an occupation standpoint. They're this is their how they make their living, but also when they close down or lose revenue, it's also service to the patients in that community. Where are they going to go from
yeah,
there? They have to
yeah,
travel great distances now, and that can be problematic, especially in a world with prior auth and access to care and all the social determinants of health that kind of go along with that. But one thing you did mention is hidden dollars, and it's even in the title of today's office
yeah.
hour. Hidden dollars. And that seems such like a marketing plug. Hidden dollars, but what do you mean? Can you walk us through a real example where a hospital uncovered revenue inside its existing operations without having to add any staff or systems?
Yeah, and we use that term a lot within our organization because it's what I'd call the hidden dollars. These are services the hospital's already providing and revenue they've already earned, but it was never billed or it never got paid. So it's not about just generating new business, it's about claiming what you've already done. One of the I'll just kind of give a brief example. A client that we've worked with in the state of Montana, 25-bed critical access facility, I would say a staple in their community. We went through 52,000 claims, did an audit, and of those, 39% of those were flagged for review. So the teams validated over a dozen issues, checking medical records, going through the claims, saying, okay, what we're seeing in the data, is it actually what's happening in real life? And stuff they found, like missed critical care charges, trauma activations, even straightforward things like infusions. They just had, they had the documentation, but the charge capture just wasn't aligned. So these are things that I would say you could address with no extra staff, no new system, just better visibility into the system. Getting the data and knowing how to use the data correctly is, I think, a big key principle. And, talking about these facilities that are operating on such thin margins, just that one in general, from the work they did, they found over $2 million lift just in that audit alone of things that they're already doing, but they weren't getting paid for because it just wasn't making its way onto a claim. They were missing certain documentation, but when they cleaned up those processes, they're making sure they're getting paid for everything they're doing, so they're not doing or giving away unintended free care.
Wow. Well, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge lift. That's
It's
significant,
a lot,
especially if you don't have to, it's just finding that there where there you didn't,
right?
as we said, didn't have to expand their staff or changing their systems. But kind of switching gears also to a topic which is strategic pricing. It sounds like such a luxury for some hospitals
Mm-hmm.
that they feel they just can't afford. So what's your approach to help teams move from across the board increases to smarter, more targeted adjustments? And building on that, some hospitals are now simulating, prior year volumes to guide pricing strategies. So
Mm-hmm.
what kind of data or tools are needed for that? And is it realistic for smaller hospitals to take that approach?
Yeah, and I'd say it's a multi-pronged approach. Some facilities have individuals that they're good at this type of work. Others don't. They might need to find outside help to either guide them or just to handle it for them. Um, strategic pricing, it sounds like something you do with a huge analytics team, but you don't need the fancy tools to make smarter decisions. A little bit ago, I mentioned using the data and using it correctly. So the data is there. We all have access to data. We know how to get it, but it could be a bunch of numbers, a bunch of statistics. It's how we use it from there is what really makes the difference. So again, mentioning you don't need access to all the fancy tools, the data, almost every EHR, you have access to what you need. So we recommend, starting with basic usage and reimbursement data, pulled straight from the EHRs to the hospitals on, getting the 835 files. You can simulate previous year's volumes with new rates to see what changes would have done and start playing with things. So when we model adjustments either up or down or high impact services, sometimes lowering prices might make sense if you're way above your peers and underutilized. Other times you're undercharging and your peers have a 6 months waiting list, for the same service. So blanket price increases just they leave money on the table. So sometimes a smarter price strategy, even with just Excel, you can outperform by a mile just across the board, X% increase, whatever is outlined in your contracts.
Right, right. So I'm hearing it's a balance, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You just need to make sure that the price is right, so to speak. Not a cliche to the popular game show that's been going on for decades now, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but it rings true. I mean, you can overprice, you can underprice. It's all about capitalizing on using the pricing to generate more revenue. And sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
that strategies that you just outlined are right on target. So, and another thing is charge capture. I mean, and charge
Mm-hmm.
capture, and making that statement alone, people probably just in their minds had all kind of visuals of what they think charge capture is.
Right.
But it's also one of those areas where everyone thinks they have under control, but quite often they don't, because you can say, "Oh yeah, we got no problems with charge capture." But
Right.
what are the most common errors or breakdowns you see?
So let's say the thing with charge capture, um, and sorry, when I'm thinking, I start playing with the baseball here.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
The thing with charge capture, I'd say it's invisible until something breaks. Most teams don't know there's a leak because the services are getting rendered, documented, and sometimes even coded, but sometimes they're never charged. We call
Mm,
that, like I mentioned earlier, the unintended free care. So some of the most common culprits would be inconsistent documentation, poorly designed EHR prompts and workflows, staff who assume the charges are dropped automatically when it doesn't. One hospital that I can think of previously that had the pleasure of working with some of their teams, they assessed what was missing and they found that critical care charges were missing in the ED nearly 100% of the time. The documentation was rock solid, but no one realized the facility side of the charge wasn't mapped correctly. So things like that, if the systems aren't set up, there's the work you're already doing in the facility is just what you would think. You're doing the proper workflows, you're going through the correct processes, but there's some things that, unless you have some type of audit on the back end or a way to check and make sure things are actually charges are being dropped, sometimes they can go unmissed, and they're like I mentioned, sometimes very obvious things, and that can lead to very high dollars that just, again, you're giving away the free care and you're not being reimbursed for it because it's not making its way on the claim and out to the payers.
Wow. Yeah. So, and I think there's a stat that, we saw, prepping for this. If you go
Mhm.
about free service, it's that those unbilled charges, so to speak. Can you
Yeah.
really call them charges if they're unbilled? But it's shocking that 1.5 to 2% of services go unbilled.
Right.
Especially in environments where there's razor thin margins. You would think, hey, wait a minute, I got to make sure I'm charging for everything I possibly can.
Mhm.
But as you just articulated, they're just not. So, what's the best way for rural hospitals to, I guess, systematically track and reclaim those missed charges?
Yeah, I'd say, you're right that that number is real. I believe that's the stat when we're talking about actually came from a study HFMA did. I think, and we're probably all pretty familiar with HFMA. Uh, in a tight margin world, 2% is massive. The key is structured audit process. Yeah, I mentioned a second ago that unless you have some type of of catch to validate processes, to make sure things are actually being done right on the back end. Sometimes they'll go forever without being caught, but having a structured audit process in place is key. I think another place to start would be, start with retrospective reviews using billing logs and coding data, match it against service specific CPT codes and any CPT that's common, but you'd say underrepresented could be a red flag. Dig into that, find out why, So we often recommend running these audits quarterly and flagging missed charges before timely filing runs out. But the real magic happens when you go more upstream. So you might
Mhm.
find issues, okay, things are being missed. Why? Being more proactive. So training clinicians to chart consistently, improving charge prompts, aligning EHR workflows, to real world behaviors. So it makes sense, being proactive and solving more at the cause instead of catching things on the back end, which, have downstream effects because we might miss a timely filing. We might just miss something completely. We're requiring more bandwidth from staff that should be focusing on other, let's say, higher revenue generating priorities. And then all the time spent and the money spent just on rework. So shifting that forward is kind of, I'd say, the best approach there.
Right. I've always been an advocate of denials prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's one thing, it seems like, the definition of insanity is doing the thing over and over and over again,
Yeah.
expecting different results. And I think, denials, working denials on the back end is kind of really emulates that because you're looking at these denials, you look at the reason codes, you correct that denial, but you never resolve it going upstream to your point. I mean, let's see how we can fix that from even happening again. So this
Mm-hmm.
denial doesn't have to even occur again. Um,
Right.
so that also speaks to root causes. I think you touched on this a little bit. Billing issues often stem from like poor documentation or handoffs.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you've already elaborated on this, but how do you help hospitals resolve those at the source?
Let's say, and this is just me throwing a number out, but if I had to give a number, 9 times out of 10, it's not bad intent. It's inconsistent workflows, like I mentioned earlier. One floor charts differently than another, or a clinician uses a shorthand that coders can't interpret. So we help those teams compare like for like departments and look for charge variance patterns. Once you isolate where the breakdown is, whether it's workflow tech, training, um, you don't know what you don't know, just a lack of knowledge base, which a lot of times it comes down to. You can fix it once you identify it. And once you fix it, one, it stays fixed or it should stay fixed. But that's how you get out of the constant rebuild cycle, or like you mentioned earlier, with denials, constantly having to just address them at the back end. Why are we having to, which that's another soapbox. Why are we having to deal with the denial problem? I think we know they answered a lot of that, but um, why can we not prevent these going forward and fix them? So, in a lot of it, you can. It takes, I'd say, a lot of upfront work sometimes, but once you get there, then it's a framework that's left in place and sustainable going forward.
Right, right, right. It's almost like rebuilding becomes the default also for many teams,
Right.
where it's
Yep.
just, again, we've already kind of spoken to that, but kind of moving to, okay, we've looked at the how, we've looked at kind of how to identify it, and also maybe how to resolve some of these issues. You can probably go a little deeper into all of that for sure, but for hospitals operating with limited internal resources, which many
Mhm.
of them are, there's staffing issues, I think we find when we talk to prospects and clients, it's still a problem. Um,
Right.
what's the balance between internal improvements and bringing in outside partners, especially in a contingency-based model?
Yeah, I'd say if you can do it internally, that's always the dream. I mean, I'll give an example of house projects. There's many that I've tried myself that, I thought I could do it. My wife may have thought otherwise and probably was the wise one to begin with, as I tackle these projects and realize, okay, I'm in a little over my head, too deep.
Yeah.
Either watch 1,000 YouTube videos or I got to find an expert, someone who can come either help me or finish it for me. Or maybe I should have started there. That's
Yeah.
always the dream is to do it internally, but most teams are already, I'd say, well overextended. The right partner should act like an extension of that team and not black box you. No heavy lift, no mystery work behind the curtain. Most importantly, they should be training your team as they go so that you're not dependent on that solution or that service provider in perpetuity. The whole goal is to be able to manage these things, clean up your system so that you can do this and carry this successful framework forward.
Mhm.
I think one of the ways, one of the models you mentioned, contingency based, running on a no risk model. If it involves any type of, say, revenue recovery or lift, those are perfect examples because those are easier tracked, and they fit that model. There's no budget required, so you're removing risk from that facility, or that facility doesn't have to take on the risk to clean up some of their processes where they might need help because they just don't have it. And that allows them to access, I'd say, more support without pulling dollars away from patient care or other areas that might need a tech solution or need improvements that will require some type of capital investment.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So those are all words of wisdom, but I'm sure it takes quite a lift, out there for them to just adopt it. I mean, you got to imagine having some buy-in, from the staff. The approach that you take to this is probably fairly delicate in some situations,
Right. Yeah,
because
absolutely.
people, to point to data, a CFO can be looking at data and think everything's great, but are they
Hmm.
looking at the right data? Is
Yeah.
that data reflecting what is truly happening? And I've always been an advocate also of data that you can take action on to make
Hmm.
corrections. Otherwise, it's just a pretty chart.
Yep.
Many times people don't get a pretty chart. Maybe it's a nice spreadsheet. They feel more proud of the accomplishment of putting a spreadsheet together than actually digging into the issues.
Yeah.
So sure you've encountered that as well. So yeah, that's Taylor, all the questions I have for now. I'm going to move it now to our segment of the Q&A from the audience. So again, just want to remind everyone that if you have a question, drop it into the Q&A or drop it into the chat. Um, we do have one question here that I'd like to read that came from the audience. So basically, here it says, apparently seems you've worked alongside hospital teams that are stretched thin.
Hmm.
Uh, if a CFO only had 1 hour a week to focus on revenue optimization, what should they do with it? That's just probably a CFO asking that.
That's man.
Yeah.
I, You think with time based and from a CFO's perspective, and I have not sat in that chair, but have worked alongside and talked to plenty of them. All their focus is, I'd say, on it's cash, it's revenue. And again, this is my personal opinion. If you only had an hour, maybe spending it on things, reviewing underbilled $0 encounters. You may be shocked at how many actually exist. Or look at your top 10 CPD codes and compare those to volume. Are there any mismatches there that deserve a second look? Or honestly sit down with your rev cycle lead and ask them, what's one thing that's always bugged you that's never been fixed? Chances are it's high impact opportunities that's just been buried under the day to day. That's where the lift is hiding, and a lot of times your teams know where that's at. They don't have the bandwidth. Sometimes they don't have the skill to get it. They know it's a problem, but it's hey, we need a solution. We need help fixing this because we know the impact will be great. So that's another thing. I think, like I mentioned, looking at some high revenue mismatches, finding the low hanging fruit, and then talk to your teams because they usually know exactly where the problems are at.
Oh yeah, that is sound advice, especially the last one. Talk to your teams uh,
Yeah,
instead of trickling down and pushing down from the, fix this, do this. Actually, speak to them about, well, why is
mm-hmm.
this reoccurring, and let them have a safe landing place to actually be honest about it, instead
Yeah,
of, so where they can actually then. I think that's where course corrections actually can take hold. Um,
right.
my opinion, that's been my experience as well. That's typically the best path to follow. So, all right, looking at any other questions. I really don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So Taylor, you're awesome. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
for
you.
office hours today. It was great having you on. You did such a great job. You'll come on again.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Always happy to
awesome.
talk about some of these things.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, and just want everyone to thank everyone else for joining us.
Mhm.
Happy to have you here as well. I just want to remind everyone that we do have a podcast if that Revenue Cycle Optimized that has even more insights that we put out and push content out there on a weekly basis. Sometimes 3 or so episodes a week. You also can sign up. Stay tuned for other office hours. Next week, we do know we're going to attempt to do a live demo of our document capture AI platform. So be sure to tune in and register for that. So with that, I just thank everyone for being with us. Again, thank you, Taylor, as well.
No, thanks, Stuart. Anytime.